Fiveable. Welcome to our live review on the Global Middle Ages. Today we're going to do lots and lots of practice on analysis. But for us today, we are going to do a live review on sourcing so that I hope you're not feeling like this medieval art image here. I hope you don't feel like you have a sword. I know some of us probably just started the class and maybe we're feeling a little overwhelmed and don't really know where to begin. But that's where Fiveable comes in. We're here to help you wherever you are and help you get the practice and skills that you need to be successful on the AP World History test. And so you don't feel like this sword in the back of your head. And we're going to do a review of sourcing. And so if you answered in the poll that you haven't done it yet or haven't had any practice yet, reviewing the sourcing is going to help kind of give you a baseline of what we're going to be doing today and how we're going to do it. And there's other acronyms that we can use. This one I just think is the most simple. And so I'd like to keep it super simple and we'll use HIP today. And then we're going to get a lot of practice using an actual document-based question. And so if you don't know what a DBQ is yet, maybe you've heard the words DBQ, but you don't really know what it is. Several different types of essays and short response questions. And one of the long response questions, the type of style of essay is called a document-based question. So what happens is you get a prompt, like a essay prompt, but then to answer the prompt, you're going to be given a set of 7 documents. And using those 7 documents, you're going to use those as evidence in your writing of answering the prompt. Now, when we look at a document-based question essay, you're given a rubric. And the rubric is how the AP readers will score your essay. And on the rubric, one of the points of the rubric is working with the documents and their sourcing. And so when it shows that in the rubric, it even gives that you have to use examples such as historical situation, audience, purpose, or point of view. And so that's what we mean by sourcing, is we're taking a really, really close look at the source of the document, at the person who wrote it, at the time frame and when it was written, if there's any bias in there because of the purpose of the document or the audience of the document, and then what is the author's point of view is that as they are. Political views of the document, we're looking to is telling us, and we're really analyzing it, we're questioning it, we're putting it into a situation and giving more background information on the document, which helps us understand how we view history. And so when we practice with the document-based question, today we are going to be using 7 documents that are all with the same prompt. And so rather than kind of jumping around and doing different topics in the Global Middle Ages, we're going to be doing kind of one overarching goal with that prompt, and then using the documents as kind of our help to lead us to our sourcing. So if you haven't had a lot of practice with sourcing, I am going to go through a few slides that give some background information on sourcing. And so in comments, if you're in here with me, if you have a different acronym that you use in your class, let us know in comments what your teacher, what your class is using. So I'm just going to keep it super simple and use HIP. That's what I use in my classes. It's kind of easy to remember for students. I always just tell them we're going to HIP the documents. And where I get the words H, I, P, and P from actually comes from that DBQ rubric. So I just pull it straight from there. Now on the AP test, you're going to have to use your sourcing, and you're going to have to do it for several different documents. And so you can use the same type of sourcing for multiple, or you can use them from a wide aspect of these. Where I always tell my students is use the one that is most glaringly obvious. If you're reading a document, you're like, wow, this historical situation is really, really important to know this document about what's going on, or this, I know something about this intended a lot, go with what's easiest. Don't make life really hard on yourself. If the point of view isn't glaringly obvious, then go with something else. A little bit of an overview of these four terms. So just kind of baseline overview, and then in my next slides, I'll go into them a little bit more in depth. I will direct you to make sure you sign up for that Fiveable premium account so that you can go back and watch previous live streams, because I did a live stream maybe 3 weeks ago on kind of an overview of sourcing where I went really, really in depth with using HIP. So some of these slides are from there, but if you don't know what you're doing with sourcing, go ahead and make sure you check out that old live stream as well. So historical context, I try to avoid that because there's a separate point on the DBQ and the LAQ essay where it is on contextualization. So to avoid some of that confusion, I'm calling it historical situation. Because when we're looking at the source in a document, it's going to give you an actual source line. It will say above the document source, and it will tell you who wrote it, maybe a little bit of a background on the document, and then it's going to give you like a date. And so using the date and using the information in the document, you can place it into a historical situation. So if it's explaining like a trend or something that's going on in that time period that you want to analyze, you can use historical situation to do that. Intended audience is who was the document intended to be directed towards. So if this is a speech, who is it to? If the audience is like a letter and it's going to one specific person, who is that audience? Why is it written in that style to them? The purpose is the intended purpose of the document. The purpose means that, like, what reason did they have to create this source? Why were they doing this? Why were they writing this? What was the purpose? What were they trying to get through with this source or with this document? And then the point of view is the author's point of view. It's not your point of view as a AP student. They're not asking you what you think about it. It's the point of view of the author. So if the author has a particular influence on the document, sometimes in the source, it'll give you a little bit of background on the person, and maybe they have a role that leads them to a little bit of an intended bias. And so that's where you would analyze the point of view. I'm going to go into these just a little bit more in depth before we get started on our practice. I want to spend the bulk of our live review on the practice, but I don't want to just jump in without any background information for you. All right, so a little bit more about historical situation. With historical situation, we really want to look closely at what's going on in this timeline of history. When you get a source, it's not like in a bubble, like, oh, this magically happened in 1254. There's nothing else going on in the world at this time. Just this document is existing. Of course, that's not true. We know lots of things are going on that are influencing what's happening with that document. So looking at the historical situation, you are going to kind of link it to your knowledge of history. And that's great because that's what you're practicing. When you're studying for the AP test, you're probably going over like events and periodization and what's going on in this time period. All of that is going to help you with historical situation. If this document is written at a very crucial time in world history, go into it a little bit more and analyze how that could influence the writing or the production of that document. What historical processes does the document relate to? When we're looking at this, in the document, if it's kind of giving you hints at like a vocabulary term of a process, like the commercial revolution or globalization, and it's kind of hinting at that, you can connect it to those terms that you already know. So if you're reading something, you're like, wow, this is explaining globalization. Then when you go to explain your sourcing, you would say that this relates to what's going on in the time period with globalization. And here's my examples from the document, how that's pointing to that historical process. And then what is the statement? I'm not just looking at that exact time frame, but maybe if there's an influence even later on with that document, like maybe that source is something that's going to be used later for a different purpose. You can continue to use that with historical situation if it's a source that's going to have historical significance or historical importance even later on, outside of just that time period in which it was written. So that's a little bit about historical situation. If you have any more questions about this, please let me know in comments. If you want me to slow down or explain it a little bit more in depth, absolutely I can do that. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in comments. All right, intended audience. I always throw the word intended in there because audience, my students I know get confused because they think they're the audience. Like, this document was written for me. I'm the audience of the document. I hate to break it to you, but you are not the audience for really any of these documents in a DBQ, generally speaking. They're not writing to you taking this AP test in May of 2020, and it's generally not going to be you as the audience. The intended audience is where the document was meant to be directed towards. So at that time frame, again, if it's in 1254, it's not going to be you because you're not alive yet. So who at that time was the audience? So is there a particular person or group of people that the document is for? If you think to yourself while you're reading this document, is there an intended audience? I don't really think this is to anybody in particular. Then don't analyze the intended audience. Again, if it's not really glaringly obvious, don't overwork yourself. I'm trying to do really too much where it's not very obvious to work with. So if there is a particular audience that this is directed towards, then it would be a good time to use intended audience for your analyzing of that source. So if the answer is yes, there is a particular person or group of people, it's probably going to show up in that sourcing line that I mentioned before. So before the document, I'll say source, and if it maybe says like a letter directed to so-and-so, well, there it has an audience. So if you know anything about that person that it's directed towards, or maybe by addressing it to that particular audience, something, or trying to convince them or trying to flatter them, that goes with intended audience. Does the audience affect the reliability of the document? Let's say that you are talking to your friend or you're talking to your principal. You're going to talk to them differently, even if it's about the same problem. Say you have a problem with a teacher. Nobody ever has a problem with their teachers, but you're complaining about it to your friend. You're probably going to be saying different things, maybe over-exaggerating to your friend to make it sound cool. But then you're going to be talking to your principal, and what you're going to say is going to be different because of your audience. You're going to sound more professional, and you may try to, back off on the language, but to make yourself seem more reliable of a source. And so how you talk to your audience is different in those scenarios. So think about that with the document. If this is written towards one person, or if it has a specific audience that it's towards, how has how they're writing affected who they're writing for? Is the document trying to influence that intended audience in some way? This kind of overlaps a little bit with purpose, but when we're talking about that specific audience, focusing more on who the person is directed towards, then we can be looking at like, they're trying to convince this one person to do this one thing, or they're trying to convince this whole group that they're giving a speech towards to do something or to feel a certain way. That can go with that intended audience if we analyze it more in depth. All right, the next one is purpose. Again, kind of throwing in the word intended purpose. A lot of times my students want to because they think the purpose is for them. Like the purpose is to help students understand world history. No, sorry, they weren't writing the document for you in 2020, writing this AP answer on a DBQ. The purpose meant to be for that time period. What was the purpose at the particular time period? Why was the document created? Is there a goal? Is there a specific thing that this document is trying to accomplish? Why were they creating this document? Why was the document created at this particular time? Sometimes the timeline affects that purpose as well. Maybe something is going on right now and they needed to get the speech out right at that moment to get these people to do something. And so looking at the purpose can help us analyze the time period as well. What is the goal of the document? Is the document trying to achieve something in particular? Is the document trying to sway us or get us to do something or act in a particular way? Even if we don't know the audience, there can still be some kind of like persuasiveness in a document. So if it just says like journal entry or speech or something like that, but it's not about the intended audience, we can look instead at the purpose. Is the document trying to get us to do something or to think a certain way? If there is an intended purpose beyond just what is written. And then lastly, does the purpose impact its reliability? If it's really over flattering to convince us to do something, maybe that over flattering isn't an accurate depiction of what's actually going on in the world at that time period. Maybe it's kind of like propaganda. We can look at propaganda images like World War I and World War II. They're trying to get us to think a certain way to impact us, but it doesn't always give the accurate depiction of what's going on at that time period because it is more of the purpose of trying to get us to do something. So maybe it is making the other side look really, really bad about something that didn't happen. And then our final P for HIP and P is point of view. And this again is not student point of view, the source's point of view. So sometimes in the source, it'll say like a little bit of background on the person, like this person was a advisor to the king. Well, we can look at that point of view because of who they are. So how is who they are or what they are shaping how they are presenting this document? And so what can we infer or guess about the source based on the information provided? If it's a priest, what can we kind of infer or guess about that source because they are a Catholic priest, period. So we're really kind of not so much guessing here, but we're making kind of some hasty generalizations. We're making these generalizations maybe about the type of person that they are during that time period. And then does that person's background influence or impact their reliability? Just like with how they're talking to somebody or their audience or their purpose, we can also look at reliability here with the point of view. So is this person's point of view, if the advisor to the king, well, they probably have an exalted position. They're not kind of like a general peasant. If they are a peasant or if they're an advisor to the king, they're going to have probably a different perspective about what's going on at that time period. So if it is a peasant, what's impacting them specifically? If it does give some background on like their political persuasion, say we have a modern text and it's a communist pamphlet. Well, what kind of influence does that have because of its political persuasion? Only use ethnicity, nationality, race, religion, if it's really, really important to the document. You don't want to make too hasty of these generalizations if it's not important to the document at that time. And so if we're using their race or we're using their gender, it has to be something that's important to the document at that time period. We just can be like, they're a woman, therefore feminist. Not true at all. You need to look really closely at the document in the time period because you need to see and make sure that that is important to our understanding of the document, and only analyze those things that are important to our understanding of the document or help us answer the prompt better or give us more background information on either the document or the prompt. Don't just do it because you're like, it is a woman, they must be writing with this bias. Don't go too glaringly obvious with that. Really take a closer look and analyze if that is important to bring up, if it's important, if it impacts their reliability with that document. Just don't say like, they're a priest, so they must be religious. Hey, that's not really going to give us any information or any deep analytical look at the document or the time period or the prompt. We really have to think carefully and critically about what we're using for our sourcing. So why the heck did I go over all of those? Well, when we're doing sourcing, we really have like 2 steps on our documentation. We need to kind of quickly identify the source. And then what we actually need to do when we write our essay is we include a sentence or 2 on the sourcing of that document. Now, in the DBQ essay, you're actually going to have to do this for 3 different documents. So when you're doing this on your DBQ essay, you're going to look at more than one of those 7 documents, but you don't need to do all 7. Some teachers will say do all 7, and some teachers will say do the minimum. I always kind of say in there do 4, so that you can have an extra one in case you screw up somewhere, or if you didn't analyze it enough. So when you read a document, on a DBQ essay, you're going to see the document, and then you're going to want to really do some close sourcing on it. And how we do that is we underline, we circle, we write in the margins. I also did a live stream on this too, so make sure you get that premium account so you can go back and watch that one on how to source documents. But what we're doing here is we're looking at the sourcing. So we read the document, we look at the source line, and then we think back to our HIP&P. Is the historical situation really important to this? Is the intended audience really glaringly important? Is the purpose really standing out? And is there a particular point of view for that document? Now, when we do our practice, we're not going to do HIP&P for every document because they're not going to be glaringly obvious. What we're going to do with our practice is we're going to pick one of those 4 to try and practice with that particular document. So we are going to practice with a real DBQ essay, a real document-based question, and that means that we're going to have a prompt. With our prompt, we're going to have 7 documents that we're going to use and attempt to answer our sourcing. We're going to pick on that document if we're going to do HIP or P, historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view. Again, don't make it overcomplicated. Pick out what is most obvious to that source. If it is really, really obvious once you read the document that the is what you want to write about, then do purpose. But don't, for our practice today, don't do purpose for each of them. I want you to really be analytical and think carefully, well, what's really standing out here? And that's what we're going to do for our practice. And then the important thing, this is going to be probably more helpful later when we get later on in the year. Right now, we're really just kind of practicing how we source. But when we go to write the DBQ essay, we need to connect it back to the prompt. It can't just be like a drop-in. You'll know this when we get to the long essay question too, if you're just like, Abraham Lincoln, and you just throw his name in there, but you're not doing anything with it, it's not helping you any. Same thing with our sourcing. We can't just be like, the source, the person who wrote this was a priest. Ha, look, I did sourcing. No, it's not sourcing. You're not analyzing how that person's historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view influence the sourcing based on the prompt. And so we have to kind of always have the prompt in the back of our head and connect it back to the prompt to make sure that we are still kind of on pace and we're still on topic about what the prompt is asking. We don't want to stray too far from the sun. All right, are we ready to begin? In comments, tell me if you are ready for our practice. Woo, got it all caps. Yes, we are ready for our practice. Now, when you go to practice these, you can grab like sticky notes, piece of paper to write them out. I always think it's really important to kind of write these things out, like actually write them out somehow. So either typing them out into comments or writing them out on a piece of paper or a sticky note, because you're going to have to practice actually writing things, because you're going to have to actually write them on the AP test. So when we do this, let's kind of talk about our steps. We'll read the document first. We'll look at the sourcing line of the document. If you're doing this at home, you would be underlining, circling, the things that stand out in the document. And then before we kind of jump into writing sentences, let's talk in comments about H, I, P, and P, which one we think is the most obvious. All right, so this is our prompt. And yes, it's about the Mongols, because there's nothing better to discuss with the global Middle Ages than the influence of the Mongols. So this is our DBQ prompt. It's analyze the extent to which the Mongol Empire affected societies of Afro-Eurasia in the 13th and 14th centuries. So let's kind of break down this prompt. We always want to break down a prompt before we get started. Just jumping into documents. It's asking about analyzing the extent of how they were affected. So when it says the extent, it's like, were they affected a lot? Were they affected just a little bit? And how were they affected? Was their government affected? Was their economy affected? How specifically was their economy affected? If they were taken over by the Mongols, how did that change that society? And so when we're writing our essay, that's going to be kind of our main points. The extent of how they were affected. And then Afro-Eurasia just means Africa, Europe, and Asia. I remember my first time teaching AP World History, my students got back from the AP test, and one of the prompts used the term Afro-Eurasia, and they came back and they were like, the questions with you, but what is Afro-Eurasia? And so I just had to make sure from then on that I was telling my students what Afro-Eurasia is. Africa, Europe, and Asia. All right, let's get into our documents. You ready? I'm pumped. All right, this is a big one. I will read it for you. I hope you enjoy the sound of my voice here. And then in comments, just while I'm reading it, think about historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point. While I'm reading the source, if he situates stands out first, but in his book, A Description of the World 1298. So that line is what I call the source line. That line here, it just gives background on who the source is, the time period, and then this one has a little bit of background on who Marco Polo was. Maybe a name that you know? The Grand Khan, now this is the actual document. This is the primary source. This comes from the book, A Description of the World, written in 1298. The Grand Khan, having obtained the signal victory over a challenger to his rule, returned to great pomp and triumph to the capital city. As was his usual practice before performing rituals for holy books upon each Christian festivals, he observed the same at the festivals of the Saracens, Muslims, Jews, and idolaters. After leaving the capital of Beijing, you arrive at the city of Kuala-Lumpur, where the women are very handsome and live in a luxurious state. Upon leaving the city, during which you are continually passing towns and castles, of which the inhabitants are idolaters, have silk in abundance, and export it in considerable quantities, you reach the city of Nguyen. This place is remarkable for a great manufacture of sugar, which is sent for the supply of the court. Previously to being under the dominion of the Grand Khan, the natives were unacquainted with the art of manufacturing sugar of a fine quality and boiled it in such an imperfect manner that when left to cool, it remained in a state of a dark brown paste. But at the time when the city became subject to His Majesty's government, there happened to be at the court some persons from Babylon, Cairo, Egypt, who were skilled in the process, instructed the inhabitants in the mode of refining the sugar. After 5 days' journey, you will arrive at the noble city of Zaitun, which is a port on the sea coast celebrated for shipping, loaded with merchandise. The quantity of pepper imported there is so considerable that what is carried to Alexandria to supply the demand of the western parts of the world is trifling in comparison. All right, in comments, what stands out the most in that document and that source? Is it historical situation? Is it intended audience? Is it purpose or point of view? There's no wrong answer, so don't feel afraid to shout it out in comments. Which stands out to you the most? Historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view? All right, once we've decided what stands out the most, then let's get our practice actually writing statements of sourcing. If you think that historical situation stands out the most, what is something that you could point out about that time frame that influences this document? So what about the historical situation influences this document at this time? So try that, writing it out on a sticky note, on your paper, or in comments. How does the historical situation stand out on this document? When we look at historical situation, we're looking at the time frame. So this is 1298. Now, looking at the historical situation here, we can look at the court of Kublai Khan. We can also look at the historical situation of Western Europe, because here, of course, we have the Mongols. Obviously, are going to stand out a lot, because it's talking about Mongol rule in particular. So with historical situation, we can point out things in this document about the Mongols at this time period. And one thing that stands out to me is in that first paragraph, because it kind of talks about how the Mongols ruled with their religious toleration. You can see they're bringing up performing rituals for holy books, Christians, Muslims, Jews, idolaters, and you can talk about how the Mongols used religious toleration. You can talk about the spread of religions because of trade throughout the Mongol Empire and into the court of Kublai Khan, which is in China. And so you can use that for historical situation. Other things is the Italian merchants, because you're going to learn this a little bit more with the Renaissance, but Italian, because without those Italian merchants, we wouldn't be getting those goods into the markets of Western Europe from the Far East, from China. Other things that kind of stand out with historical situation here, it's a little bit for me about globalization of people. I mean, if we're talking about historical situation relating to a process, it's talking about globalization. It's talking about how the influence of trade, silks. And then I think what's kind of cool is that paragraph on the sugar. You can kind of read over that one because it's like, oh, it's just talking about sugar. But it's also about globalization, how the local people didn't know how to refine sugar. But because of the globalized nature of Afro-Eurasia at this time, because of trade, we have influence from Egypt that is changing how sugar is refined, making it of very, very high quality. All right, anybody think intended audience? If we're doing intended audience, who's the intended audience? This is a book, a description of the world. Any guesses on who the intended audience is there? Who would it be towards? What type of person? Do you think it's towards Chinese people? Do you think it's towards people in the Middle East? Do you think it's towards a particular person? It's actually more towards fellow merchants and Western Europeans. Because if you know anything about Marco Polo, the writings of Marco Polo really do influence and pique the curiosity of Western Europe. And his writings make Western Europeans kind of idolize the Far East and idolize the Silk Roads and idolize the Mongols and all of these luxury goods. And so using intended audience could work here. Purpose kind of goes with that too. What are they trying to do? What is Marco Polo trying to do with his writing a description of the world? Is he trying to convince people to travel? Maybe. I mean, he's doing a pretty good job explaining that it's safe and that there's really a great variety of luxury goods to be had. And so maybe you think the purpose is to convince people to travel. And then point of view is on Marco Polo. Some people somehow have like a really deep understanding of Marco Polo. There's a show on, even I think it's an HBO show, and I don't think it's school appropriate, on Marco Polo. Maybe you can, if you know some background information that's influencing this document, you could use that as well. Again, only use what's glaringly obvious. For this first example, I went through all H, I, P, and P, and because this one you can kind of do it for all of them. But for the next one, again, you only need to source on something that's glaringly obvious. So let's go on to document 2. So document 2 comes from Friar John of Montecorvino, a letter sent to fellow Franciscans who were working as missionaries in the Black Sea area and then later forwarded to Rome, 1305. All right, so just looking at the source requires you to have some type of background information on these terms. So does if you know what a friar is, that would be helpful. If you know who the Franciscans are, that would be helpful. If you know what a missionary is. All right, so let's just kind of go into the background. Friar, a Christian. The Franciscans were a branch in the Catholic Church that had a converting mission, and then later this letter was forwarded to Rome. So who is that forwarded to? Who's there in Rome that's high up, important in the Catholic Church? The Pope. And so that kind of gives us, we have to kind of read into a little bit more. So this was a letter sent to fellow Franciscans and then forwarded on to Rome. So this is the source. Here's what he wrote in his letter. I, Friar John of Montecorvino, departed in 1291 and entered India. And I was at the Church of St. Thomas the Apostle for 13 months. And there I baptized in different places about 100 people. And I, proceeding further, came to Cathay or China, the realm of the emperor of the Tartars, the Mongols, who is called the Great Khan, and him I invited, presenting him the letters of our Lord Pope, to adopt the Catholic faith of our Lord Jesus Christ. But he had grown too old in idolatry. However, he bestows many kindnesses upon the Christians, and for these 2 years I have been abiding with him. As to the route, I may mention that the way through the land of the Goths and of the emperor of the northern Tartars is the shortest and safest. As far as I ever saw or heard, I believe that no king or prince in the world can be compared to the Lord Khan in respect of the extent of his dominions, the multitude of his people, or the amount of his wealth. So which of those 4 is most obvious? Is it historical situation? Is it intended audience, purpose, or point of view? Write in comments which of those 4 you think is most obvious. For me, I do actually think this one is going to be intended audience. And intended audience and kind of purpose link together. And I'm explaining how I think that is the case. Because this is a letter to other Franciscans who were missionaries. That means that their goal is to convert people. If you want to convert as many people as possible, you're going to want to go to an area that has a lot of people and an area that is open to conversions. And what does this say in the letter? It says that the land of the Great Khan has a multitude of people a lot of wealth, and as it shows here, he was very open. He bestowed the kindness upon Christians. It's safe to travel there. And so if you're a missionary, you're traveling, you want someplace that's safe, you want a large group of people to convert, and you want them to be open to your religion. So I think intended audience kind of stands out to me for this document. So how I kind of would explain it is that Friar John is trying to explain that the areas of the Great Khan in China are going to be open for conversions. And that kind of ties to the purpose. So if it ties to the purpose, what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to convert the people. And so this would lead to an influx of Christian missionaries into the Far East. So you can use that with intended audience. A little bit more about like the point of view you can do with this, because you can do it with the Franciscans or the missionaries. You're going to explain their goal of converting, and then you can also kind of tie in historical situation. It shows some historical processes here. It explains the shortest and safest route from Europe to Asia is going to be along those Silk Roads, because they're safe because of the Mongols and that Pax Mongolica, that safe passage, and because of the unity of the Mongol territories. Anything else that you guys think is kind of important or stands out for your sourcing, add it in comments. All right, now that we've done kind of an overview practice on those first two documents, now with the rest of them, we're going to kind of go one step further. We're going to tie it back to the prompt. So let's remember what that prompt said. It was analyze, I'll flip back so you can see it again. Analyze the extent to which the Mongol Empire affected societies of Afro-Eurasia. So we need to look at the impact that the Mongols had on Afro-Eurasia. So those first two were just kind of, what do we look at for sourcing? Now we're going to kind of pair them two together. So then 3. Source selection from the Novgorod Chronicles, a collection of histories focused on the church as written by Russian religious authorities of the City Republic of Novgorod, 1238. And the princess ordered, give us your numbers for tribute. The common people would not give their numbers for tribute, but said, let us die honorably for Saint Sophia, the church in Novgorod that represents the symbol of freedom, prosperity. But most of all, the people were divided. And it was on the morrow, the prince rode down, and the accursed ones, the Mongols, began to ride through the streets, writing down the number of Christian houses. Because for our sins, God has brought wild beasts out of the desert, and having numbered them for tribute and taken it, the accursed ones went away. All right, so again, what stands out the most? Historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view? I think for this one, for me, I would say probably historical situation. So now that we have that in our head, let's tie it back to the prompt. How is the historical situation explaining the effect and impact the Mongols had on peoples in Afro-Eurasia? So what is the impact here? It's talking about tribute. So let's tie it to the historical situation. This, of course, is in Russia. And so we have the Mongols coming into Russia. So we can use our historical situation, what we know about history. We know that the Mongols, as they conquered into the areas of Kievan Rus or modern day Russia, they kind of loosely governed these territories and set up tributary systems, forcing the people there to pay tribute to the Mongols to be left alone. And so here in this document, it does a great example demonstrating that tributary system, how the Mongols would come in and they would gather tribute and then go away. So that explains the historical situation and the impact, because of course, these people in Russia were impacted, having to pay tribute to the Mongols for their continued protection. But other things we can point out as well in this document, we can use kind of the point of view or purpose We know that this is from a religious document. And so you can see here that it's trying to kind of glorify the Christians in the areas for refusing to give tribute. It's obviously making the Mongols look really, really bad. They're literally calling them accursed because of them forcing and taking tribute from the good Christians in that area. And so using that, making sure that we're connecting it back to the prompt on how it impacted those people and tying them together. All right, document 4. Source: selections from the History of the World Conqueror, 13th century, by Ala ad-Din Juvani. Juvani was a Persian who was so impressed by the Mongol capital of Karakorum that he decided to write the history of Mongol conquest. He also serves as governor of Baghdad for his Mongol overlords. In this portion, Juvani writes of Sorkatani Beki, daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan. After Ulugh Noyan's death, the Khan commanded that as long as he lived, affairs of the state should be administered in accordance to the counsel of his wife, Sorkatani Beki, and her sons, that the army of the people, great and small, should be under the control of her command and prohibition. And her hand was ever open in munificence and benefaction. Although she was a follower of the religion of Jesus, she would bestow alms and presents upon imams and sheikhs, and strove also to revive the sacred observances of the faith of Muhammad. And as a token and proof of the statement, she gave 1,000 silver bailish that a madrasa or college might be built in Bokhara. So again, which stands out the most? Is a historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view? This one for me is the point of view, and we haven't had one of these yet. So the point of view of this person, because there's so much background on the source, gives us a good insight in the point of view. This was a governor of Baghdad who was put in his position because of the Mongols. So he's going to want to make the Mongols seem great. He wants to retain his position as governor because he is kind of a flunky. He's in that position because of the Mongols, and he wants to maintain his position there. So how does that demonstrate the impact of the effective societies? Well, for that, we can say that the Mongols set up governors to help rule their ever-extending kingdoms. And in his writing, Juvani was wanting to make them seem open and tolerant and put them on a high pedestal so that he could retain his position as governor under his Mongol overlords. We can also do historical situation for this one. I think this one is kind of cool because it explains the role of women and descent of the Mongol Empire. It explains, of course, the role of a woman in a position of high power, which we didn't generally see in the world at this time period, particularly in like Western Europe, not so much. Also, historical situation explains religious toleration. You can see here the impact of those conversions. This high-ranking Mongol woman was a convert to Christianity, but again, demonstrating that religious toleration of the Mongols, and we can see that in that second paragraph. And so again, tie it back to it, the prompt about the impact that the Mongols had in Europe, in Afro-Eurasia. Here it's the impact in Baghdad in the Middle East. All right, document 5. Sorry, I'm speeding up a little bit because the better we get, the quicker we can go. We don't want to spend too much time on our sourcing because we still have to write a whole essay. Not today, but in general. Document 5, source, excerpt from Florentine merchant Francis Pegolotti, Pegolotti's Book of Descriptions of Countries, early 14th century. The book was meant to be a travel guide for other merchants traveling east. The part focuses on trade in Yuan China. So Yuan China, if you didn't recall, is the Mongol Empire of China. That was the name they took. The road you travel from Tanit to Cathay is perfectly safe, whether by day or night. Whatever silver the merchants may carry with them, the Lord of Cathay, which is China, will take from them and put into his treasury. And to merchants, they give that paper money of theirs in exchange. This is of yellow paper, stamped with the seal of the Lord aforesaid, it called Balishi. And with this money, you can readily buy silk and all other merchandise that you have a desire to buy. All of the people of the country are bound to receive it. You shall not pay a higher price for your goods because your money is of paper. There are 3 kinds, one being worth more than another according to the value established for each by that lord. So this one seems like pretty straightforward, just kind of a description, but think closely on what's most important: historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view. I think with a short one like this, you kind of work with what you got. So the 2 things that stand out, we have the purpose written in the source line. This book was meant to be a travel guide for other merchants traveling east. Well, you don't want to scare other merchants traveling east. You want merchants to come back and bring a lot of variety of goods for the people to get in Western Europe. And so the purpose there is how we're explaining that merchants are connecting along the Silk Roads to China. And so connecting it back to the prompt, how is that important to this? Well, we want to ensure the safety of merchants from Europe so that they bring back a lot of wares and goods from the Far East and introducing those into the economy of Western Europe. Also, what I think is really obvious is historical situation, because here it's explaining the kind of a comparison between Europe and China, because China seems a little bit more advanced at this point. They're using paper money, and they don't even have that really. We're not using that in Europe at that time. Paper money invented in China. They're explaining how you use, it's basically currency exchange, exchanging your coins for paper money. And then you would exchange that paper money for goods. And so it's explaining that influence on Europe. We know that they don't have paper money yet in Europe, but introducing it from China is going to impact the economies of Western Europe to more of a commercial economy rather than a barter economy. Also, again, historical situation explains the safe travel from Europe to Asia, again, because of the connectivity of the Mongol Empire. That kind of Mongol peace, that Pax Mongolica, was perfectly safe for Mongols, for people to travel to the Mongol Empire from further afield. So using that, connecting it back to our prompt, that is how we do document 5, even though it seems very, very straightforward. Easiest, what's most obvious. Intended audience, kind of. Point of view, do what's most obvious for you. Or document 6, not a lot of background on this source, so we're going to have to read more into the document. Just says contemporary Russian chroniclers, 13th century. It happened in 1237. That winter, the godless Tartars, the Mongols, under the leadership of Batu, encamped at Onuza, which they took and burned. From here, they dispatched their emissaries, a woman witch and 2 men, to the princes of Ryazan, demanding a tithe, which is a tribute. The princes of Ryazan did not allow the emissaries to enter the city. The princes of Ryazan engaged them in a battle. The struggle was fierce, but the Mongols emerged victorious. Thus angered, the Tartars, the conquest of the Ryazan land with great fury. They destroyed cities, killed people, burned, and took people into slavery. On December 6th, the cursed strangers approached the capital city of Ryazan, besieged it. The princes of Ryazan shut themselves up with the people of the city, fought bravely, but succumbed. On December 21st, the Tartars took the city of Ryazan, burned it completely, killed Prince Yuri Igorovich, his wife, slaughtered other princes, and of the captured men, women, and children, some they killed with their swords, others they killed with arrows and then threw them into the fire, while some they captured, they bound, cut, and disemboweled their bodies. The Tartars burned many holy churches, monasteries, and villages, and took their property. This one is not so flattering on the Mongols. So which is most obvious? Historical situation, intended audience, purpose, or point of view? This one's a little bit hard because we don't have a lot about the people who wrote this. So we really can't do a lot with like point of view. More we could do with purpose because of what's being written in the document. Whereas we saw in other documents, they were under Mongol rule and they were flattering them. This one, of course, puts them in a very bad light. So here in these chronicles, they're trying to elevate the sacrifices of the princes because it's their Russian history. They want them to be more like martyrs for the cause of the Russian people. They refused to fall under Mongol rule. They fought bravely into the very end. And then, of course, it describes the Mongols as godless. They're, burning cities. They're cursed strangers. So how is that impacting the people in that place? Because remember, the prompt is about the effect that the Mongols had in these areas. You can explain that in this source, the purpose is to elevate the view of those Russian princes who fought bravely against the Mongols, to make the Mongols look bad, because they burned cities, they disemboweled people, and in these Russian chronicles, wanting to make the history of that time one in which was Mongol rule was negative. And then, of course, the impact the Mongols had in areas that refused to surrender to them, they would just completely raze the cities to the ground. They would burn the cities. They would slaughter thousands and thousands of people. And so in some areas, of course, we can use that as a view of Mongol cruelty. And so in these areas that refused to surrender to the Mongols just completely destroyed those territories. Could also be written as like a warning to other cities in the area, but it's a chronicle, so it's kind of historical in that sense. All right, we got one more to go. You're hanging in there with me. This one is a picture. Always like to throw a picture into a DBQ because students don't really know how to analyze the source. That's why we have to really look at that source sign. So let's see what it shows. Source, this is the Siege of Baghdad, 1258. This is from a Persian manuscript in the 15th century. So we got two dates. So the Siege of Baghdad was in 1258, but this manuscript and this illustration came from the 15th century. So it came a couple hundred years later. The image depicts the Mongol assault led by Hulagu on Baghdad after a 12-day siege. The Abbasids did not surrender to the besieging Mongols and were ultimately defeated. The Mongols sacked the city and executed many. Estimates of deaths have ranged from 80,000 to upward of 1 million, though the lower estimate appears to have been more likely. So again, what stands out the most on this? Is it the intended audience or point of view? Now, this one has a lot of similarities to our previous document because even though it's an illustration, it's explaining the sacking of another city. So we had the sacking of the city of Ryazan, people disemboweled and killed by the Mongols when they refused to surrender. Here we have it in a visual depiction of a different city of Baghdad. And so here we can that same purpose. They are chronicling making the Mongols look like horrible people. They're displaying the Mongol cruelty, besieging the town, 80,000 to 1 million people, and destroying the city of Baghdad. Now here we have what I think is probably most easy, most obvious is the historical situation. If you know anything about the siege of Baghdad, or if you know anything about the Abbasid Caliphate, that's where we can pull in that historical knowledge. So we know that the impact of the Mongols in this area is to end the Abbasid Caliphate. by sieging the capital city, their capital city of Baghdad, and destroying the capital city, really brings an end to that Abbasid Caliphate. And as we know, though the Abbasid Caliphate was of a long line now for about 600 years of Islamic rule across the Middle East and North Africa. And here it brings it to an end. So that, of course, is the impact, back to our prompt, of the Mongols in that area. It ended the Abbasid Caliphate and ended the Islamic Caliphate rule over the Middle East from their capital city of Baghdad. And the destruction, actually, during the siege of Baghdad, ruined the city of Baghdad for years and really destroyed the population there for decades. And so using that historical situation, knowing things about the siege of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate actually is connecting it back to the prompt as well and using our sourcing. Other things that we can kind of pick out from the image, you can see the what we have here with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. They're using those the walls of the city, trying to use their walled city as a defense. But also you can see in this image the Mongol technology, how they use besiegement technology, things like catapults, and even cities that had battlements like this were really no match for the Mongols. I can also use it with the historical situation about, like what we did with the last prompt. In cities that refused to surrender, they were met with fire and fury by the Mongols, who utterly destroyed the city of Baghdad and ruined it for decades. Hard to do point of view on this one. You could try with, because it's a Persian manuscript and that they're trying to depict the Mongols in a negative light because they're attacking the city. You can see the people fighting bravely against them, but it's really hard to do. Same with intended audience. If it's not glaringly obvious, don't try to do it with that. All right, how'd we do? We made it to the end. We got a lot of practice. I know kind of when, as you get better at this, sourcing is just going to become second nature in how you're reading the documents. You're going to be able to pick things out and source them. But again, when you're doing it, keep in mind, what is obvious? What stands out to me the most? Is it the historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point of view? So think critically about prompt. I know this was kind of an overview. Later streams, we're really going to kind of focus on more clear-cut examples, but always have that prompt in the back of your mind. This was about how it affected societies. Well, that's pretty vague. So we can connect it in a variety of ways, but always think of it in the back of your mind when you're doing your sourcing is, how do I get it back to my prompt? How do I get it back to my main points I'm making in my essay? Keep practicing. This is something that's not going to happen overnight. You need to practice on your sourcing so it becomes second nature to you. Remember that sourcing is a DBQ point. I've had students in the past not get sourcing right away and they just write it off. They're like, I'm not even going to try. You want to set yourself up for the most points possible on the AP test. To practice it so that you can at least attempt it to set yourself up for success and getting the most points that you can on that DBQ. And then we have a ton of upcoming streams on the Middle Ages. And so make sure you're tuning into our other live streams. We've got some this week and next week on the Middle Ages. So if you were a little shaky on the content for the historical situation, come back and tune in for our upcoming streams on the Middle Ages. I hope to see you there. We have one coming up on the Mongols. So if you knew nothing about the Mongols, this DBQ is probably pretty hard for you. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm glad you got some. And make sure you follow us on all of our platforms at Think Fiveable. You can follow me also on Twitter. I am at Mrs. Thiessen. This is Allie Thiessen signing off. I hope that you guys have a great evening, great rest of your day, and keep up that practice. We'll see you next time on Fiveable. Bye, guys.